Welcome to another episode of Chax Chat. Join Chad Chilius and me, Dax Castro, where each week we wax poetic about document accessibility topics, tips, and the struggle of remediation and compliance. So sit back, grab your favorite mug of whatever, and let's get started.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Chax Chat podcast. My name is Chad Chilius. I'm an Adobe certified expert and Adobe certified instructor and one of the accessibility wizards here at Chax Training and Consulting.
And my name is Dax Castro. I am one of the other accessibility wizards here at Chax Training and Consulting. And Chad and I are both certified as accessible document specialists. And if you'd like your certification too, head on over to accessibilityassociation.org and click on certifications. I did realize I was looking on social media, Chad, and they have these things called badges now, where you can get a badge for being proficient at the CAG 2.2 and that kind of thing. So that was something I had not known that IAAP has.
Yeah, I think they're distributing that through Credly.
Yeah.
Do I have that right? Credly,
so.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, a couple of the organizations are doing that. IAAP being one of them. I think Adobe is doing that as well. I think it's something that a lot of the organizations are jumping on board. I mean, it's a way for us to kind of share that, you know, we're certified or whatever. I mean, listen, Dax, I don't know about you. Between you and me, nobody's ever asked me if I'm certified.
Right.
Like with the work that we do training, we do consulting, we do everything. Nobody's ever said, oh, wait a minute, are you certified? And I've never actually had that question asked of me, you know, but not to say it doesn't have value. I'm just saying, like, nobody's ever asked me that question. You know?
Well, you know, it's interesting that I was having a conversation with my best friend, ChatGPT, and I was talking about the fact that I say, oh, yeah, well, we helped write the standard. Mm-hmm. You and I helped write the accessible document specialist test. And she said, yeah, I don't know that that's really important, Dax. Like, it is a good thing to have. And if someone asks you about your accreditation or your level of involvement in accessibility legislation or rules or anything like that, that you can always say that. But to lead with that, no one ever says, oh, well, we want to go with Chax because Dax and Chad helped write the standard. Right. And so that made me think about it. I'm like, yeah, it was great being on that team. And if you listen to this podcast, you know, we've mentioned it quite a few times, but it's not, that doesn't mean you are any less of a knowledgeable person because you weren't on it, because you didn't help write the test. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you or I are something uniquely special because we did. It just means we have a body of knowledge that helped contribute to the whole for writing the test. And we have enough background to be able to, you know those answers. So.
And to be fair, I mean, you know, we're not unique in that. I mean, there's many of the people that we worked with on that project who also contributed to the test, you know.
Oh, yeah.
So
Paul Reyes.
It definitely took a village. Yeah, Paul Reyes was one of them.
Yep.
And several other people for sure.
Yeah. Awesome. So today I wanted to talk about something really cool. So we had a client come to us and say, hey, I'm working on a graphic novel. And for those of you who might not be familiar with that term, it's comic book, right?
Comic books,
they're working on a comic book. But maybe more than, you know, comic book, we think of the old, you know, 25 cent or, you know, whatever paperback kind of thing. These are more like full-on books. If you're into anime, you know, a graphic novel there's a lot of understanding what that is. But how do you make that accessible? It's a highly visual thing. And you and I were just at Creative Pro Week a couple weeks back, and I was sitting next to the booth for, what was the press company that was next to us, Chad? I thought it was something with a W.
Something publishing, W.
But anyway, I was sitting next to their booth, and I while I was in between breaks and classes, I happened to go over there and was looking at some of the documents on their table that they had published. And one of them several of them were graphic novels. And so when this person that we're going to talk about today came over to me and said, hey, I want to, the client wants to move forward with this graphic novel. What do we do? And I walked over to the booth and I pulled open one of these graphic novels and we started looking at it. And I said, look, here we've got this mechanics graphic novel talking about, I don't know, I think it was small engine mechanics, but they used this kind of zombie theme with flies and goo and all this visual stuff. And it would have been a disservice, I think, to not describe some of those things if you were just looking at it from a clinical standpoint of, what is this content trying to say? You know, is there meaning in this zombie with the goo dripping off his finger as he's tightening this bolt, right? Most people would probably say, if the goal is to learn how to fix this machine, yeah, I don't care that it's a zombie or what's dripping off his finger. But the artist created this very immersive experience that they were trying to relate in this book. And that's the point of a graphic novel, is that it creates an immersive experience. And so how do you create that or replicate or give equity to that experience for someone who uses assistive technology, right? And so, so I wanted to go over the 7 steps that I think are important to getting a good roadmap for handling a graphic novel. Now, if you guys stick with us through the end of this podcast, I won't say that you're going to be an expert at how to do a graphic novel, but at least it will open up your mind to maybe some different thinking about how you approach it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. So, so the first one is understanding the story. And just like we talked about, right? What is the message that's trying to be conveyed, right? If we're looking at a children's novel, often you've heard me talk about the hunter walking through the forest and all the visual elements that are not in text. You know, usually a children's novel is one sentence: the hunter creeps through the forest, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and you know, and you and I had this discussion before the podcast, but I want to bring it up to our audience as well, where like when you started describing this to me, what it made me think about was audio descriptions for movies.
Yeah,
right?
Audio description. Remember, audio
yes,
description.
Thank you, Dax. Roy Samuelson will smack my fingers for saying that. Audio description for movies. And I just felt like there was a really solid parallel between, you know, because in a movie, you have closed captions or even if you can hear the actors' voices, you don't really know what they're doing.
Right.
And that's the point of audio description, is to add that context where it'll say, John walks into a dark room with, a sliver of light, peeking beneath the door. It adds context to it. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about here, Dax, right?
Well, and it gets even more interesting because as you and I were talking offline, I mentioned the fact that often I'm watching a movie or a video or something with captions on, and I get a spoiler because they ask a question or they do something and the answer comes up in the caption before the person actually speaks it. And then you're like, crap, I already know the answer. And it kind of takes away from the story. So most people might think, well, graphic novel, Dax, you write the tag, you make sure the text is tagged and then you describe the image. Well, it's not that easy because sometimes there's a complex nature to the image, right? That there are certain things you want to discuss with certain pieces of copy that are in the bubbles, the chat bubbles, and others you want to hold on to and wait and release that information a little bit farther down the line. And so being able to look at the content and understand the reading flow, the story, right? This is step 2. Establishing the reading order is really key because you can make it a really cool and suspenseful user experience, or you can have all the spoilers in the middle of the thing and it just doesn't feel the same as it's not an equitable user experience, right?
Right. Well, now, Dax, so like as you're describing this, I'm envisioning that there will be cases So before I say this, so like, how do you determine the story? And I'm kind of like lobbing you a softball here.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, to determine the story, go ahead.
You kind of have to read the novel, right? Like
Well,
you literally need to read it, where like, in a lot of projects we do, we'll write alt text somewhat out of context sometimes just because we have to get through the process, right? But to write it accurately, even in regular projects, we have to often read the body text to figure out how they're referencing that image and how that figure is being leveraged in the document.
This is where you and I have a difference. My ADHD is my nemesis. I cannot write alt text without reading all the context and looking at the beginning and looking at the end. What came next? What came after? What came before? What are the contexts? What are the colors telling me? All the things my brain needs to know before I sit and write the alt text. And I think that has to do with my need for input.
Yeah.
That constant need for the feedback. And, but yeah, no, I totally get that. Sometimes you're just trying to get through it. For me, those times are a lot more rare because my brain won't let me.
Right. Right. And so then the next thing I wanted to ask you is like, so, we talk about this often when we talk about writing alt text for figures, especially complex figures. We will often break that figure up into multiple chunks, right? So that we can provide the descriptions that's needed without writing a novel of alt text for one big image. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I'm curious, like, do you provide the user with any upfront information? You know how, like, sometimes when we do that, Dax, we'll say, in the next 5 figures, we're describing such and such, right?
Right.
And so I'm curious if you provide the user with any upfront information in the beginning of the book where you kind of tell them that, hey, throughout this document, we often leverage this technique to provide descriptions for you. Is that something that you include in that graphic novel?
I think my answer is going to surprise you. I think my answer is no.
Okay.
It's a graphic novel. I'm not picking up a textbook where it's got 3 pages of infographics that are uniquely different than the rest of the book. If I'm choosing to read, I don't know enough anime to if I pick up some anime book, I understand what my user experience is about to be.
So you feel that that's assumed, right?
Yeah.
Like if the user is reading a graphic novel, they need to kind of expect that experience, right? Like
Yes.
that they expect that there could be situations where there's multiple figures in a row, or weaved in between the text, right? I mean, you were talking about that as well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the fact, so for those of you who aren't aware, when assistive technology gets to the word, to a figure that is anything not in text, it says graphic. And then it reads the description, and it might throw the word graphic in there about every 25 characters or so to let you know you're still in a description. And then it says graphic at the end, right? And then you move on. So there is a cue that you are moving from body copy to the to the text representation of a graphic. So you're going to hear graphic a lot in a graphic novel. Unfortunately, there's not really a way to turn that off because you lose the context, the difference between what's body copy, what's balloon text, and then what's visual representation. And so I think it's a necessary, I don't know if evil is the right word, but a necessary process to go through because you need that juxtaposition of text versus imagery, right?
And I think that makes a lot of sense, now that you say that, because like if the user knows that they're reading a graphic novel, right? So that there's a certain expected user experience that they're going to encounter. So that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Awesome. Well, and then the third one, we're kind of already talking about this, is establishing the visual hierarchy, right? That's really what we're talking about. What is the order of importance for this content? Right? We've got text and we've got images, and we have to decide which come first and which come second, because it's not always that the text comes before the image. sometimes, like you were saying, Chad, we need a lead in to the text, and then the text, and then more context with the image, right? Especially like in fight scenes where someone might say something and then someone hits the person, pow and bam, and all these things are going on in the imagery, but then there's also these text balloons. If you just wrote, pow and bam, and then two, supervillain and hero are fighting each other or throwing blows. I mean, yeah, that's alt text, but it's not really, it's not immersive. It's not really a story like you would kind of get visually. And I think that's important. So we've got understanding the story, establishing the reading order, and then step 3 is identifying the visual hierarchy. And then what's step 4, Chad?
So step 4 is to determine the information dependencies. So I'm assuming what you're talking about with that is like, kind of like integrating the text with the images,
right?
Throughout the graphic novel, right?
Yeah, it's about understanding what copy goes with what image and in what order, right? Does it matter? Because sometimes it won't matter. Sometimes you can have the image first, or you could have the text first. There's no dependency there on one or the other. The story tells it the same way, regardless of whether you read the text or read the image first. And I think that what you need to decide is what came before this. Did I just read a text bubble, or did I just read an image description? When it's inconsequential which way you go, then maybe you develop the pattern of text, image, text, image, text, image. But that's a choice you need to make, right? You're trying to understand the user experience so they don't hear graphic, 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 back to back, back to back. They can have a little bit of differentiation from the pace between the text and the image. So you understanding the dependency of the information on that text is really important. Well, and then just go ahead, Chad.
So number 5?
Yep.
So describe the visual story, not the interpretation. So what do you mean by that, Dax?
So it's interesting. Often people fall into the trap of, well, I think I know what they meant, but this is really what I think they should have said. And so when they look at a graphic, they interpret it rather than define it, right? They might infer an emotion or an action or a subtext that isn't really in the image, or they might have knowledge. Let's say it's a graphic novel and 3 chapters back, or in a 2 books back, so-and-so had some backstory with this villain, and someone decides to write in the alt text something about how their look of anguish because so-and-so did something in such and such chapter, right? Previously, like they're pulling from other context that's not directly in the image itself.
Don't impose your personal feelings about it. Stick with the facts.
I think embellish is the word. I think embellish is that word you were searching for. Don't embellish. Don't add additional facts. Just like if you were trying to write alt text for 2 people walking across the street, you wouldn't include alt text that talks about the legislation about crosswalks or what year that the curb cut came into play. That's not the point of the alt text. The alt text is there to describe the image, not to give backstory. Backstory is where traditionally captions come into play, because those are different than alt text. And you would never really, I guess you could argue that the text in a graphic novel is in essence a caption.
The caption. Right? Yeah.
So I guess if it's not, therefore, if it's not in the bubble, in the caption, you shouldn't try to add it into the alt text.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, because now you're starting to describe a potentially inequitable experience where you're giving somebody using assistive technology more information than say a sighted person who's reading the same information.
Right. I mean, if you think of something like the Lord of the Rings, right? There's so much lore and backstory that goes between all the different characters and all the different books that you could find yourself starting to add backstory into the alt text about other things. And if I'm not using assistive technology, I'm not getting that information unless I mouse over the image.
Well, and I'm sure you've got to be careful who you task with writing this alt text. Right. You know what I mean? Like, you almost need somebody who's not really close to it.
Sure.
I feel like they're the ones who could fall into that trap that you're talking about, right?
Agreed, because they're emotionally connected to the story and they want to fill, it's now this new medium of, oh, I can add this in here that wouldn't fit on the page or wouldn't fit into the context. So, yeah.
That's cool.
Definitely so. And then so step 6 is prioritize meaningful detail, right? So we've got understand the story, establish the reading order, identify the visual hierarchy, determine information dependencies, describe the visual story, not the interpretation. And then next one is prioritize the meaningful data, right? So looking at the text and the image, you want to focus on the meaningful stuff first. What's the most important thing, right? If the guy's crashing into the mountain, that is a huge important thing versus the sky, or maybe it's the laser beam is shooting from across the screen and it, hits the spaceship, right? Mm-hmm. There's an order of information and an importance. And so putting the most important information first, I think really does help provide a better, useful story.
Absolutely. I love that.
Yeah.
And then the last thing you have here, Dax, is to review the reader experience.
Right. And I think this is the one we harp on no matter what kind of content we're talking about. It is about listening to the end result. You need to go through and listen to it and use the keyboard. It's not just about what you hear. It's about the mechanics of the navigation, right? Because just as much as if you made 30 boxes because you broke this apart into a bunch of different things, boy, you're going to realize that's way too many boxes the moment you're like down, 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 down. You're like, okay, this is enough downs. This is way too fragmented. And I don't think you get that unless you actually walk through that user experience.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's a balance there, Dax, right? Like I feel like from a technical standpoint, it's probably easy to fall into that trap where you're like, ooh, I want to break this graphic into all these separate pieces.
Yep.
But then as you just described, it's like, okay, now I'm going to listen to it and I'm like, oh, wow, this is kind of exhausting, yes. Having to like delve through all this. So I'm sure in this process, you try to find a bit of a happy medium.
Yep.
Right. Of like, okay, let's not break this down too deep, but let's break it down enough that I can tell my story, describe things appropriately, and, find that balance of a good user experience.
I mean, I was just thinking of something as you were talking. There are times where you could use those keyboard navigations to your advantage for pace. If you're like, and he exploded, into space, you could put the and in one box, the he in one box, and the exploded into space in another. So you're literally
to create that experience.
To create the experience. So you could use it both to your, you could be careful about using it too much, but you could also use it to your benefit to create a really engaging, physically engaging story.
I really like that. Like as you're describing that, I'm like, I could see how that could be really helpful and engaging for somebody, because you're kind of forcing them to take it in certain chunks and create emphasis. That's
what it reminded me of? That old video game, Dragon's Lair, where Dirk the Daring. So Dirk was this goofy knight, and you'd watch this video And then what would happen is a little thing would flash, and that was your cue to go left or right or up or down or duck or whatever it was. And if you did it right, the video would continue playing to the next scene. And so things would happen and these little flashes would happen, and you have to time it just right. And I was thinking of that same kind of user experience where you're pressing the down arrow to get to that next block of content to, kind of go through it. So very physical way to kind of do it. But again, balance, right? It is about balance, and you don't want to overdo it. So
sure,
definitely. So, Chad, we were just as a tie back, we were talking about the publishers at Creative Pro Week. So that was Walsworth Publishing. I know you kind of did some research while we've been doing the podcast, but that was Walsworth Publishing, and they do a great job at providing some really cool publishing options for different types of print styles and coatings and format. Really cool stuff.
They're a phenomenal. They're a publisher and a commercial printer, I believe. They do all of the above, as a matter of fact, like when I worked for Walsworth, they were doing all of the yearbooks for American universities, American K-12 schools in Europe.
Oh, okay.
That was the connection that I had with them. So they were publishing all of their yearbooks, and let me tell you that their yearbooks really changed from when I was in high school. Dude.
Oh, I bet.
My gosh! Like I was like, what? This is crazy, Because like in my yearbook, it was just everybody's photo in a grid. You know what I mean? That was the extent of the yearbook.
When we were in high school, it was still paste up, and you were still, with the tape. What was that tape called that you bordered all your images with? There was a specific name for it. David Blattner is probably rolling over in his car, screaming at the monitor, telling.
Listen, I literally have an art bin in my garage, and I have that tape in the art bin. I promise you. Yeah. I forget what the name of it was. I'm thinking of the Koh-i-Noor pens.
Okay.
That we used to use to rule lines, and stuff like that. And James Walmser, I'm going to give a shout out to James. He works for Walsworth Publishing. We saw him last week, 2 weeks ago at Creative Pro, and he works for Walsworth. They do amazing work. If anybody out there is in need of, printing services, I would definitely recommend you reach out to him.
Well, I hope that this has really given you some ideas of how to approach a graphic novel. So just to review, understand your story, establish the reading order, identify the visual hierarchy, determine information dependencies, describe the visual story, not the interpretation, prioritize meaningful detail, and then review the user experience. And if you can follow those 7 steps, guys, you're going to create some really cool stuff. And if you are stuck or you want help with this, we would love to work with you on your graphic novel. We've got some other tips and tricks on how to produce this. How would you do this in InDesign? We didn't even go into the fact of how do you physically lay this out so that all these techniques can be easily implemented, because the graphic novel that we got as a sample, everything is one big image with the text. The text is just in its own little containers, and that creates some problems. So thinking about designing with accessibility in mind, there are some other things that you need to consider. So reach out. We'd love to see you. chaxtc.com, our new website. If you have not been there yet, go to chaxtc.com. We've got upcoming classes. We've got conference stuff. We've got lots of handouts, really cool stuff. And we'd love to connect with you more. And you can even click on the Ask an Expert and book time with us individually, and we can walk you through solutions. We have never been stumped, Chad. I don't think there has ever been a problem someone has brought us that we have been like, nope, sorry, can't help you.
And you know what? I wouldn't phrase that as us tooting our own horn. I would just phrase it as we've been doing this a long time, and we've learned how to get really creative.
Yeah.
And to that point, all we're saying is, like, we could help you. We could find a solution to the problem, right? And there's been some project stacks where it's been new to us. We're like, oh, I've never done one of these, but then either you and I will sit down and we'll kind of like what do they call that?
Triage through,
nimble through it, or isn't there like a word for that or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, like you and I will like go bounce back and forth and throw ideas back and forth, and then we'll be like, oh, that was a good idea. Like one example was you and I did it was an org chart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where the client wanted a way for people to understand how a person or who a person reported to.
Yep.
And
that was Colorado Department. Yeah, that was Colorado Department of Transportation. And we did go ahead.
Well, actually it was Penn State. The one I'm thinking of was Penn State.
Oh, see, and I'm thinking of the one I did.
We may have done it for Colorado as well. Yeah.
Colorado DOT, they had a unique one where they had a block at the bottom of their org chart where they needed to go, a user needed to be able to get to that block from the bottom right, from the right side of the org chart and from the left side of the org chart. And once you use one item in a PDF, it's taken. So we had to create some really unique ways to allow a person to circular to get there. So, always cool to iterate through custom solutions.
To us, it's fun. Like, honestly, like to us, it's fun. Like when somebody brings us a challenge, I'm like, oh, let's do, you know what I mean? I'm
laser
ready to
focus.
dive in. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. We hope you found this useful. I know it's kind of like a unique topic that you might not have had on your bingo card, but I think it's just a really interesting discussion, and I hope you found it useful.
Oh, Chad, my ADHD brain just went off. Bingo card. We should introduce downloadable bingo cards for the Chax podcast. So when people are listening to it, so you could be, here's one, I'll give you some examples. To be fair. You say to be fair a lot.
Do I? Okay.
To be honest, to be fair. If I'm being honest, that's the phrase. If I'm being honest, right? I say right a billion times, right? So we could come up with a bingo card that is the idiosyncrasies of the Chax podcast, and people could play along and as the podcast goes on.
So I encourage everybody to reach out to us, via email, via LinkedIn, whatever. And let us know what your thoughts are on that, if you think it'd be a fun thing to do while you're listening to our podcast.
Yeah, if we get enough responses, maybe we'll put it together.
I love that. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for tuning in today. My name is Chad Chilius.
And my name is Dax Castro, where every other week we unravel accessibility for you.
Thanks, guys.